In Glenridge, a quiet suburb known more for its rules than its warmth, a simple family barbecue sparked a reckoning. When Claire Weston saw a black father grilling in the park with his children, she saw a threat to her idea of order. She confronted him, lied about the rules, and called her husband to escalate. What she didn't know was that Darius Cole was a retired Navy officer trained to stay calm under fire. When they attacked him, he defended without hesitation. When they endangered his children, he pursued them. What followed was caught on camera and spread across the country. False accusations, exposed lies, and a trial that forced a community to face the truth. Claire thought she could control the story, but this time, the truth had witnesses. And this time, the lie didn't win. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. It was the kind of Saturday that made the world feel slower, like time itself had been persuaded to stretch just a little longer so families could breathe, laugh, and live without rush. Glenridge Park basked under a generous sky, the kind of blue that didn't even try to share space with clouds. The sun touched everything it could reach, wrapping picnic blankets, swing sets, and stroller paths in a soft, glowing warmth that made even silence feel friendly. Darius Cole had chosen his spot early, long before the other families began to trickle in. He'd walked the park perimeters twice that morning, inspecting the layout as he always did. Not because he was paranoid, but because life had taught him that peace was rarely given freely. It had to be claimed, and then protected. Nestled near a gentle bend of the walking trail, under the light shade of an old maple tree, the spot was perfect. Close enough for the kids to see the other children playing near the monkey bars, but far enough to avoid the swirl of chaos that always seemed to follow a busy playground. The table was clean, the grass soft but dry, and the tree provided just enough cover to keep the midday heat from pressing too hard. The grill was small but efficient, a compact propane setup he'd kept in top condition since his Navy days. Every motion was deliberate as he unpacked the cooler, checked the flame, and spread out a neat cloth across the table. Ava stood nearby with her quiet precision, already arranging paper plates and utensils in orderly lines, her eyes flicking to her father every few seconds. Not for approval, but simply because she liked mirroring him. Caleb, energetic as ever, darted between sips of juice and dramatic football moves, narrating his imaginary game under his breath like he was already playing in the Super Bowl. It was the kind of family moment people claimed to want. Normal, simple, harmless. Darius took it in with quiet satisfaction, the kind that only came from knowing you'd done right by your children and given them something good in a world that so often did the opposite. He turned the ribs carefully, letting the heat sear in the marinade, the smoke rising in lazy spirals that smelled like memory. Summer, home, comfort. He felt her presence before he saw her. There was a shift in the air, not cold exactly, but still enough to draw attention. A weight, a stillness that didn't belong to any of the mothers chasing toddlers or teens flopped on picnic blankets. It was the kind of stillness that observed, rather than joined, and it hovered just long enough to pull him out of the rhythm of his work. Darius straightened, glancing up with calm awareness, and saw her standing near the gravel path, watching them without pretending not to. She was the picture of restrained disapproval. Mid-40s, with blonde hair styled into soft waves that didn't dare fall out of place. Her blouse was a faint pink that had clearly never met grass stains or a child's sticky hand, and her pressed slacks clung neatly to a body that stood too rigid to be casual. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, her chin lifted with the subtle angle of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She made no attempt to hide her inspection, and when Darius offered a polite nod and a neutral expression, she began walking toward them with careful steps, each one purposeful without being rushed, like she wanted to make sure her approach wasn't mistaken for anything less than justified. "Hello," she said, as she stopped just short of the grass, her voice wrapped in a practiced sweetness that didn't quite mask the tightness underneath. Darius returned her greeting with a slight nod, one hand still holding the tongs as he adjusted the meat on the grill. Afternoon, her eyes swept over the setup, the table, the cooler, the children, the grill, and returned to meet his with a smile that barely held together. "Beautiful day for it," she offered, voice light but strained, as if she were trying to test the ground beneath their interaction before stepping further. "Sure is," Darius replied, not rude, not eager, just steady. "I'm Claire, by the way," she continued. "I live just over the hill on Glendale Court. I walk here most mornings." He didn't offer his name. She didn't need it. "I don't think I've seen you around before," she added, as if the absence of familiarity were an offense to be corrected. "We come when we can," Darius said, adjusting the grill's flame just slightly. "First Saturday we've had free in a while." Claire's eyes lingered on the grill a little longer than necessary before returning to his. "Right. It's just, I wanted to mention, we usually don't see people using grills over in this part of the park. It's more of a quiet area." Darius kept his tone level. "It's a gas grill, less than 12 inches across. I checked the park's website last night, just to be sure. This area's listed as an open zone with proper ventilation." Her smile faltered at the edges, though she quickly recovered it. "Well, that's very responsible of you. Most people don't go that far." "I don't like trouble," he replied, not as a defense but as a declaration. She gave a small chuckle, just a touch too brittle. "Of course not. I just think it's important we all do our part to keep the community peaceful. We've worked hard to maintain certain standards." Darius didn't respond right away. He let the silence do some of the work, then turned slowly to face her fully. "We're not disturbing anyone. We clean up after ourselves. We're not loud. And we're following the rules." Claire nodded, but the tightness in her mouth never left. Her eyes drifted again toward Ava and Caleb, who had both gone quiet, watching the exchange from the table. "I'm sure you mean well," she said, her voice dipping into something softer, something that tried to imply grace without offering any. "I always do," Darius answered, folding the towel in his hands with care before placing it on the edge of the table. There was no hostility in his voice, but there was no space left for her to keep pretending. Claire stood there a moment longer, her mouth pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore, as if she was waiting for him to flinch or stumble, to step out of line and make it easier for her to justify what she was already thinking. He didn't. He turned back to the grill without another word, but he didn't stop listening. He could feel her still standing there, could hear the faint shift in her breathing, and he knew she hadn't walked away, not because she had anything left to say, but because she was still trying to decide how far she could push. The smoke curled upward in gentle spirals, clinging to the warm air like it didn't want to leave. Darius adjusted the grill cover, lowering the flame slightly to keep the ribs from charring, and reached for the tongs again, but he could still feel the weight of Claire's presence hanging just beyond his shoulder. She hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted her stance. The silence should have been a signal to let it go, to finish her little interruption and walk away like it had never happened. But people like her didn't know how to walk away, not when they felt something was being taken from them, even if it never belonged to them in the first place. She stepped forward, her heels pressing into the grass now, arms still folded but voice a little tighter, a little more deliberate. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, her gaze fixed on the grill like it was something unclean. "I've lived in this neighborhood for a long time. We've had issues before with people bringing in cooking equipment, leaving grease stains, smoke getting into the homes nearby. It's been a problem." Darius didn't look at her right away. He took his time, flipped one of the ribs, and let the silence do most of the talking. When he finally did lift his gaze, it was calm, steady, rooted. "I told you," he said, voice even. This is a gas grill. No coals, no flame exposure. It's elevated. Nothing touches the grass. The regulations are posted on the park's official website. Claire pressed her lips together in a way that looked more habitual than intentional, like she'd done it 1,000 times when she was trying to keep the upper hand in a conversation. I've spoken to the HOA about this park more times than I can count. I'm well aware of what the regulations are. Darius reached into the pocket of his cargo shorts, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times before holding it up without a word. There it was. The screenshot of the Glen Ridge Park Usage Guidelines, pulled straight from the city's official website. He zoomed in slowly, his finger highlighting the passage in bold. Portable gas grills under 12 inches in diameter are permitted in open recreational areas with proper clearance and ventilation. Claire's eyes flicked to the screen, but she didn't lean in. She didn't even glance at it long enough to read. Instead, she let out a short breath, sharp and tight, like she'd just been corrected in a way she couldn't dismiss. Well, sometimes the online information doesn't match what's actually enforced, she said, her tone shifting from sweet to clipped. And people like you always seem to find the loopholes, don't you? Darius didn't react. Not visibly, but something in the way he stood, shoulders square, head high, gaze locked, shifted slightly. Not aggressive, not defensive, just still. Ready. I'm following the rules, he said again, slower this time, making sure each word landed exactly where it needed to. You don't have to like it, but you don't get to rewrite it. Claire's jaw tensed. She looked past him toward the table where Ava and Caleb sat, now both quietly watching. Ava had stopped helping with the plates. Caleb had the football cradled against his stomach. Neither child spoke, but Darius could feel their eyes, feel the questions they weren't asking yet. Claire turned back to him, and this time there was no attempt at politeness in her voice. No pretense. Just that brittle edge she'd been holding back. "This is a good neighborhood," she said, her words suddenly louder, her tone biting. "We work hard to keep it clean, safe, respectable. We don't need people coming in here thinking they can turn it into some backyard cookout." Darius said nothing. She took another step forward. "I'm sick of watching this place turn into something it's not. You don't get to show up here, take over our space, ignore how things are done, and pretend it's all fine. It's not. People like you ruin things." Still, Darius didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just turned slightly, angling his body so she no longer blocked his view of his children. "Go ahead and call whoever you want," she added, mistaking his silence for surrender. "They'll listen to me." He stepped away from the grill, wiping his hands on the towel before folding it neatly across the side. Then he turned to his kids. "Ava, Caleb, pack the food back into the cooler. Grab your bags. I want you both to go wait in the car." Ava hesitated, her brows pinched with concern. "Dad, go on," he said gently, but his voice held firm. "It's okay. Just wait for me there." Caleb looked between his father and Claire, confused, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Are we leaving?" "Not yet," Darius said. "Just sit tight in the car. I'll be there soon." The kids moved quickly, Ava guiding Caleb with one hand on his shoulder as they gathered the food and backpacks. Darius watched them until they crossed the grass, unlocked the SUV, and slipped inside. He waited until the doors shut, and Ava leaned over to check the locks before turning back. Claire was still there, watching the whole exchange with a mixture of smugness and suspicion, like she thought she'd won something. But Darius's face gave nothing away. His jaw was set, his eyes, calm as ever, no longer invited conversation. She looked back at him, hands on her hips now, and tilted her head in that same way people did when they were about to say something ugly and didn't want to feel responsible for it. "I don't care what the website says," she spat. "You don't belong here." The words hung in the air for a moment too long, like a bitter taste no one could spit out. Darius stood completely still. No reaction, no raised voice. Just the sound of the grill behind him, the hiss of propane, and the slow sizzle of ribs still cooking. as if the food didn't care about any of it. He didn't step forward. He didn't back away. He just looked her dead in the eye, and for the first time since she walked over, Claire took a half-step back. Claire held her stance, though something in her posture had shifted. Her voice was still sharp, still laced with that brittle superiority she carried like armor, but Darius could see it now. Underneath the words, beneath the carefully practiced smile and suburban certainty, there was something beginning to splinter. Her expression faltered in the stillness he gave her. Most people would have said something by now, argued, defended themselves, tried to make her feel guilty, but Darius didn't do any of that. He just stood there, watching her, calm and unbothered, and that unnerved her far more than any raised voice ever could. She turned, almost reflexively, as if hoping someone nearby might catch her eye, someone who might step in and validate her sense of control. But no one was paying attention. A jogger passed by on the trail with headphones in. A young couple sat on a bench far off, laughing to themselves. The world wasn't watching her. And that, somehow, made her feel smaller. "I should have known," she muttered, brushing at her blouse as if she'd picked up something dirty just standing near him. "You people always find a way to make things uncomfortable." Darius didn't speak. He didn't even blink. Claire took a few steps toward the trail, then stopped and turned back, clearly unsatisfied with how it all had landed. "You know, I really was trying to be polite. I tried to talk to you like a neighbor. Gave you the benefit of the doubt." "You didn't give me anything," Darius said evenly, not raising his voice. "You approached me with a lie, escalated with an insult, and now you're hoping I'll react so you can feel right about whatever story you're already writing. That did it." Claire's face twisted, and for a split second, her mask dropped entirely. No more pretending. No more strained civility. She stormed toward him in 2 sharp strides, her hand coming up fast, open palm swinging hard. The slap cracked against his face, sharp and echoing. But before she could retreat, Darius's hand shot up and caught her wrist. His grip wasn't violent, but it was strong, solid enough to stop her cold, firm enough to let her know the line had been crossed. His fingers closed around her arm with precision, not to hurt, not to threaten, but to hold her in that moment, and make her feel the full weight of what she'd just done. His eyes locked on hers, no longer calm, no longer detached. There was anger there now, measured, burning, and deeply rooted, the kind of anger that didn't scream or lunge, but stood tall and made itself undeniable. That was when Claire screamed. The sound tore out of her throat like a siren, shrill and practiced, her entire body jerking backward as if he'd done something far worse. She stumbled a step, one hand clutching her chest, while the other flailed for her phone. "Oh my God!" she cried out, her voice pitching up in fake terror. "He hit me! He just attacked me! Someone help!" Darius didn't move. He didn't clutch his face, didn't ball his fists, didn't step toward her. He just stood still, eyes narrowed slightly, as he watched her begin to spin the scene into a lie that had clearly been waiting in the wings the moment things hadn't gone her way. Claire's fingers fumbled with her phone, but she recovered quickly. Her voice was loud enough now to carry, projecting panic like a second skin. "He's threatening me!" she shouted, voice climbing. "He's being aggressive! I need help! I need Dan!" The name burst out of her mouth like a flare, her thumb tapping frantically at the phone screen. She paced in a tight circle, breathing heavy on purpose, her eyes darting toward the edges of the park as if hoping someone, anyone, would see her and believe her version first. Darius exhaled slowly, not because he was tired, but because he knew exactly what came next. "Dan, it's me," she said into the phone, her voice suddenly trembling with theatrical fear. "You need to come right now. Some man just got violent with me in the park. Yes, Glenridge. He's threatening me. I don't know what he's going to do. Just, please, hurry." She ended the call and clutched the phone to her chest, like it was a lifeline, breathing hard, eyes still scanning the space for witnesses that hadn't yet arrived. Darius turned his head slightly, looking toward the SUV where Ava and Caleb were watching from behind the windshield. Their faces were tight with confusion and fear. Ava had her hand on Caleb's shoulder, holding him still, but her wide eyes never left their father. Darius gave her a small nod, calm and steady, just enough to tell her it was okay. He needed her to know he was still in control, even if everything else around them wasn't. Claire started pacing again. "I'm done being polite," she said, louder now. "I tried to be civil. I tried to have a conversation. And this is what I get? Violence? Intimidation? This is exactly why people like him don't belong here." She didn't care who heard her anymore. Her voice was reaching toward the sky, toward the other corners of the park, baiting someone to come validate her version, someone to step in and confirm that her fear was real, that her story made sense, that the black man near the grill was the one out of line. But no one came, and Darius still hadn't said a word. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, eyes flicking back to the trail every few seconds now, scanning for her husband. He could almost see it in her posture. She was holding her breath for backup, waiting for Dan to arrive and take over the story, to raise the stakes the way she couldn't. And when she finally heard the familiar rumble of a lifted black truck approaching from the street, her whole body shifted. She turned toward the sound with new energy, stepping away from Darius now, no longer needing to pretend she was in danger. Her relief wasn't subtle. It was visceral. The truck screeched to a stop near the curb, tires biting the edge of the grass. The door slammed open before the engine even cut off. Dan Weston stepped out like a bullet, broad-chested, barrel-necked, the kind of man who looked like he spent more time yelling orders than listening. He had the build of someone who'd peaked in a high school football uniform and had been trying to relive it ever since. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms marked with half-faded patriotic tattoos, and his walk was already aggressive before he'd taken 5 steps. "Where is he?" Dan shouted, not even looking at Claire. "What happened?" Claire pointed, and the finger wasn't shaking. "There," she said. "That's him." Dan turned, eyes locking on Darius with the kind of rage that didn't wait for answers. Dan Weston didn't walk. He advanced with the swagger of a man who believed every inch of this neighborhood belonged to him. His boots hit the grass with deliberate weight, each step thrown forward like a warning shot, shoulders squared and fists already curling at his sides as though the fight was already in motion before a single word had been exchanged. Behind him, Claire remained still, arms crossed and expression unreadable, her silence holding the kind of satisfaction that came not from justice, but from knowing someone else would do her bidding for her. She didn't run after him. She didn't call his name. She simply let the moment carry itself forward like a fuse already burning toward a fire she had lit. Darius remained where he was. He didn't back away, didn't stiffen or raise his voice. There was no need to posture or posture back. He had seen men like this before. Men who led with rage and followed it with fists. Men who believed that being loud made them right, and that being feared made them strong. His hands remained loose at his sides, his stance relaxed but grounded, his breath even. The stillness around him wasn't the absence of tension, it was the control of it. Dan came to a halt just a few feet away, close enough to invade space, but not close enough to land a blow. His face, already flushed from adrenaline and fury, twisted further as he shouted across the narrow distance that now separated them. "You touch my wife?" he growled, the accusation not a question, but a declaration. Darius didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, measured, unbothered by the volume or the venom behind the words. "She slapped me," he replied without blinking. "I stopped her from doing it again." Dan's jaw clenched visibly, the muscle twitching near the hinge like a coiled spring. His shoulders lifted higher, chest puffed as he stepped even closer, closing the space between them with the kind of reckless energy that came from knowing, deep down, he had already lost the argument. "You put your hands on a woman?" Dan barked, his breath sharp with accusation and sweat. "She hit me," Darius repeated, this time with a sharper edge under the calm. "And I didn't hit her back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move first. But I won't let anyone hit me and expect to walk away like it didn't happen." Dan's face contorted further, rage eclipsing reason. "You think you can come into this park, come into this neighborhood, mess with my wife, and walk off like it's no big deal?" Darius didn't move, didn't shift his weight, didn't raise his hands. Instead, he spoke the way someone does when they've spent a lifetime calculating risk in seconds and surviving by refusing to make the first wrong move. "You've been lied to," he said. "You're upset because she made you upset. But if you swing at me, I promise you, what happens next won't be what you expect." Dan didn't need permission. He needed a target. The punch came not as a test or a warning, but as a release, a wide, heavy hook thrown from his shoulder with the full weight of blind rage behind it. But it wasn't fast, it wasn't tight, and it wasn't trained. Darius moved without rush, without fear, simply pivoting on the ball of his foot, stepping into the motion and letting the wild swing pass clean through empty air. As Dan stumbled forward from the force of his own momentum, Darius placed one hand on the man's shoulder, guiding him past, not with malice, but with a deliberate calm that said he had no interest in this fight, but would not retreat from it either. Dan caught his footing and spun back around, red-faced and breathing harder, already halfway through another sloppy swing. This time Darius met him, not with a punch, but with precision. He deflected the incoming arm at the wrist, stepped in close to smother the attack, and drove the heel of his palm into Dan's side, striking just below the rib cage in a clean, targeted motion designed not to harm, but to interrupt. Dan staggered back a step, wheezing, but not done. The park, once peaceful, now simmered with attention. Several people had turned to watch, some frozen in place, others slowly reaching for their phones. A man near the benches lifted his camera instinctively, not yet sure what he was witnessing, only that it was escalating fast. Dan came again, teeth bared, swinging harder now, arms wild and full of brute force. Darius didn't retreat. He ducked under the arc, wrapped an arm around Dan's shoulder as he passed, and turned his body with just enough control to send the larger man stumbling again. He didn't slam him. He didn't throw him. He redirected him. Again. "I don't want to fight you," Darius said, his voice low, controlled, spoken just loud enough for Dan to hear. Dan responded by shoving him with both hands, nearly chest to chest now. Darius absorbed the impact, adjusted his footing, and dropped low, sweeping one foot behind Dan's ankle while guiding the man's upper body forward. The move was subtle, fast, efficient. By the time Dan hit the ground, the fall looked like a mistake of his own making. Still, Darius didn't follow. He didn't press the advantage. He stepped back, palms open, eyes steady. But Dan wasn't finished.
Igen move bo din funbotin yesden hako nens showen the toten in the moment dikim bre vanitor den ning hibis morin the penny 120 nim the penniness when betum gibin den ning beoven eat the better this voice but sister at the matter.
"Don't let him do this to you." Dan pushed to his feet once more, eyes locking on Darius. And still, Darius stood ready, but not aggressive, not triumphant, only grounded, waiting. Dan rose like a man fueled by nothing but pride and rage, brushing off the dirt clinging to his shirt as if it were Darius himself. His breathing came hard through flared nostrils, the weight of being watched now compounding his anger into something more dangerous. He wasn't just trying to prove something to Darius anymore. He was trying to prove it to the eyes recording from a distance, to the neighbors who'd begun to circle near the edge of the grass, to Claire, who stood with her arms crossed, nodding like she could will him into victory. His pride was bleeding, and the only thing he wanted more than revenge was for everyone to forget the last few minutes ever happened. "You think this is your place?" Dan growled, chest rising and falling in heavy bursts. "Think you can walk in here like you belong, barbecue your ribs, raise your damn kids, act like this park is yours?" Darius didn't respond with words this time. He rolled his shoulders, shifted his weight, and kept his focus sharp. There was nothing left to argue. Dan lunged again, this time with both arms extended, aiming to tackle. The force drove Darius backward, heels scraping through the grass, and for the first time, he stumbled slightly. Dan took the opening and drove his shoulder hard into Darius's ribs, lifting and slamming him into the side of the picnic table with enough power to shake the condiments and rattle the loose grill lid. Darius's back hit wood with a dull thud, and the pain flared through his side, but he didn't cry out. He gritted his teeth, pushed through the hit, and twisted his body before Dan could repeat the move. "You think you're better than me?" Dan spat, one hand swinging wide and catching Darius across the jaw, snapping his head sideways. The strike wasn't clean, but it was solid enough to sting, and Darius tasted blood at the edge of his tongue. He didn't retreat. Instead, he shifted low, ducked under Dan's next punch, and delivered two lightning-fast body blows, first to the gut, then to the side of Dan's knee. The first strike forced the breath out of Dan's lungs, and the second broke his balance, sending him buckling just enough for Darius to pivot behind him. He grabbed Dan's arm, wrapped it across his own shoulder, and executed a clean judo-style hip toss that brought Dan crashing to the ground. But Darius didn't walk away. He stepped back, jaw tight, blood at the corner of his mouth, chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. His shirt clung to his body now, streaked with sweat and grass stains. His eyes stayed locked on Dan, reading every twitch of movement, every attempt to rise. "You're not fighting for your wife," Darius said, his voice calm but louder now, carrying over the hush of the onlookers. "You're fighting because you couldn't stand the sight of me standing here like I belong." Dan shoved himself up again, wiping at his mouth where spit clung to the corner. "You don't belong," he growled. "None of you do. Not in this neighborhood. Not around our families. You show up with your grills, your music, your attitude, like we're supposed to be okay with it. And you thought if you hit me hard enough," Darius replied, "I'd disappear." Dan charged again, wild now, a flurry of fists and elbows that no longer carried the sharpness of a plan, only the exhaustion of someone fighting against the inevitable. One punch landed square against Darius's ribs, sending another jolt of pain up through his side. Another grazed his temple, just enough to blur his vision momentarily. But Darius steadied himself and absorbed the chaos, ducking low, stepping to the right, and driving his shoulder upward into Dan's chest to knock him off course. Before Dan could recover, Darius moved in again. One sharp elbow to the chin, one sweeping leg kick to drop him down. And as Dan hit the ground again, Darius dropped to one knee, grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, and pulled him just enough to meet his eyes directly. "You came here looking for a fight," Darius said, his voice low but forceful. "But what you didn't expect is that I've been in real ones, with men who didn't talk, who didn't get second chances. You thought this would be easy because of the color of my skin, because you believed your fear mattered more than my presence, but you picked the wrong one." Dan struggled, but his body no longer moved with certainty. His strength was draining, the pain settling into his limbs now, the burning in his lungs too loud to ignore. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, trying to push against Darius's chest. "I know you're the kind of man who only fights when he thinks he can't lose," Darius said, "and the kind who runs to his fists when words stop working." He released Dan's shirt and stood, rising back to full height, standing over the man without looming, without threat, only truth. Dan tried to rise again, but this time his knee buckled halfway up. He dropped to one side, gasping, arm wrapped around his ribs. Across the park, the air had gone still. The crowd was quiet now, many of them holding phones still aimed at the scene, but none of them speaking. The fight was no longer just a blur of bodies and shouts. It was something else now, something being seen clearly. Claire's voice cut through it all again, shrill and cracking under the weight of what she was witnessing. "Get up, Dan!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "You have to get up!" But Dan didn't move, and Darius didn't speak. He just turned, finally, and walked back toward the SUV, his hands aching, his jaw throbbing, but his posture still tall, his stride slow and full of clarity. Behind him, Dan remained on the ground, surrounded by the silence of everyone who had watched the truth unfold. The ache in Darius's ribs pulsed in quiet rhythm with every step he took across the grass, a dull pressure that lingered beneath his breathing but didn't slow him down. Behind him, the crowd had fallen into a strange, uneasy hush, not quite dispersing, not quite interfering. Eyes followed him as he moved, heads turned slightly, phones still hung mid-air, but no one spoke. No one dared break the silence left behind after the fight. Even the children who had been running through the field earlier were gone now, called back to their parents or led away by watchful hands. It was as if the entire park had paused to see what he would do next. Darius kept his focus on the black SUV beneath the trees, the sun flashing in the windshield as he approached. He could already see Ava's face in the back seat, pressed close to the glass, her wide eyes watching him like she didn't quite believe it was over. Caleb was beside her, still and silent, his small hands resting in his lap, his expression unreadable. Darius approached with slow, steady steps, his jaw tight, his body sore but upright, his breath held in the space between control and exhaustion. He crouched beside the passenger side window, the weight of the afternoon pressing behind his shoulders, and waited for the window to roll down. Ava cracked it just enough for his voice to carry. "You okay?" he asked, his tone low, deliberate, made gentle for them even when everything inside him still burned. Ava nodded, her voice too soft to answer right away, but her eyes did not leave his. "He hit you," she finally said, barely more than a whisper. "We saw him." "I know," Darius said, glancing between them both, his voice even and steady, without a trace of the pain that still sat in his ribs. "But we're okay now. I'm here. You're safe." Caleb looked up then, quiet as ever, his words slow and uncertain. "Can we go home?" And Darius was just about to answer, just about to let himself say yes and mean it, when the sound came. It arrived like a gunshot, a sudden explosion of noise that shattered every fragile piece of peace left in the moment. The windshield cracked with a sickening burst as a jagged rock slammed against it, splitting the glass into a spiderweb of shards that spread outward from the point of impact like a slow explosion. The children screamed in unison, Ava ducking with instinct, her arm thrown protectively around Caleb as tiny slivers of glass skittered across the dashboard and into the seats. The SUV rocked slightly from the force, but it was the sound that lingered, that loud, unmistakable crack of violence ripping through the quiet. Darius spun around, already knowing who had thrown it before his eyes confirmed what his gut had told him. Claire stood near the curb with her arm just lowering from the throw, her face flushed not from panic, but from bitter triumph, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she couldn't quite contain her pleasure at what she'd done. Dan stood a few steps behind her, one hand braced on the side of their black pickup truck, still breathing hard from the earlier fight, still battered and bent, but smiling. His posture sagged, but his expression was victorious, the kind of smirk worn by someone who hadn't won the battle, but believed he had finally wounded his opponent in a way that mattered. They had made it personal. They had involved his children. Darius didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't say a single word. There was no time for that now. Everything inside him moved all at once, The breath in his chest, the heat behind his eyes, the fire that had been controlled for so long now surging forward like a tide that would not be held back any longer. He launched forward without hesitation, his body no longer carrying the limp of pain, but the purpose of a man who had reached the limit of restraint. Claire turned first, her shriek slicing through the air, no longer a performance, but a genuine reaction to what she saw coming. She bolted toward the truck, fumbling with the door handle as Dan limped around to the driver's side, wrenching the door open and scrambling inside with all the grace of a man running from the consequences he had earned. The engine roared to life as Darius sprinted across the grass, his legs moving like memory, each step precise and exact. A rhythm drilled into him from years of chasing real enemies in places where hesitation cost lives. He reached the tailgate just as the truck lurched into reverse, the tires ripping through the edge of the trail with a high-pitched squeal. Darius grabbed the handle and pulled, but the gate was already locked from the inside. Dan yanked the gear into drive, spinning the truck around hard as Claire screamed beside him, her hands slapping against the window in panic. But Darius was already in motion. He didn't stop to weigh options, didn't pause to calculate odds. He took 3 quick steps back, built speed, and launched himself forward, his hands catching the rim of the truck bed as he hauled his body over the side and dropped low into the space behind the cab. Wind rushed past him as the truck accelerated down the narrow park road, tearing around a bend and bouncing over a curb as Dan overcorrected his steering. Darius crouched low, one hand bracing against the metal toolbox bolted near the cab, the other gripping the bed's inner wall as the truck swayed beneath him. He didn't look back toward the SUV, didn't let his mind wander to the broken windshield or the terrified eyes that had watched the violence unfold. His focus was forward now, on the truck, on the road, on the 2 people who thought they could do what they did and vanish. Inside the cab, Claire turned in her seat, her mouth moving frantically behind the rear window, her eyes wide with terror. She slapped Dan's arm, pointing back, and Darius could just barely see her lips form the words he had been expecting from the start. "He's in the back!" Dan slammed his palm against the wheel, shouting something he couldn't hear. The truck swerved again, harder this time, bouncing off the shoulder before straightening. Darius shifted his weight, adjusted to the new momentum, and moved forward, planting one foot slowly against the flat surface of the toolbox as he reached for the rear window. The glass was old. The frame was loose, and Darius knew exactly how to break it. The truck rattled beneath him as it tore down the side road, its wheels grinding against uneven asphalt, engine growling like a wounded animal. Darius remained low in the bed, his weight distributed evenly, his muscles tight and poised as he reached slowly toward the rear window. The cab swerved slightly with every turn Dan took, but Darius adjusted with the vehicle's motion, his body moving not in resistance but in cooperation with the chaos, like a man surfing the violence until he was close enough to shut it down. The frame around the rear window was weathered, the metal chipped from years of exposure, and the latch that should have secured it had already loosened under the pressure of earlier blows. Darius gripped the edge, pressed his fingers beneath the groove, and with a sharp jolt of force, popped the sliding glass panel off its track. It shifted just wide enough to let the wind scream through the gap, and just wide enough for him to slide his arm through. Inside the cab, Claire let out a high-pitched scream the moment she saw his hand breach the space between them. She pressed herself against the door, flailing as if swatting at a ghost, her face contorted with panic. No longer feigned, no longer controlled. Dan cursed, shouting over the engine noise, his knuckles white around the steering wheel as he tried to keep the truck straight. Darius didn't wait for an invitation. He wedged his forearm deeper into the cab, gripped the back of Claire's seat, and used it to pull himself forward, lifting his upper body halfway through the open window. The wind rushed past his face, whipping his shirt back against his shoulders, but he didn't blink. He reached toward the gear shift, fingers brushing the base of it, just as Dan glanced into the mirror and saw him. Dan reacted instinctively. With a barked curse, he reached into the floorboard beneath the seat, his hand disappearing for only a second before emerging with a crowbar, thick, rusted, and already swinging. Darius ducked just in time. The bar struck the top of the rear window frame with a hollow metallic crack that sent shards of weakened glass scattering into the truck bed. Claire screamed again, throwing her arms over her head, trying to retreat into the passenger door as Dan prepared to swing again. But Darius was already moving. He grabbed the edge of the window with one hand and used the other to plant himself fully into the opening, his legs still braced against the truck bed, his body a hinge between chaos and control. As Dan swung again, Darius deflected the blow with his forearm, pain slicing through muscle and bone. But he didn't pull back. He didn't retreat. He struck. Darius's hand shot forward, locking around Dan's wrist with surgical precision. He twisted sharply, turning the angle just enough to force the crowbar from Dan's grip. It clattered to the floor, bouncing against the pedal well. Dan growled, tried to grab him, but Darius was already inside. With one final surge, he slid fully through the rear window and into the cab, planting a knee in the center console as he reached across Dan's chest and slammed the gear shift into neutral. The truck lurched violently as the engine spun and the wheels lost power. The sudden drop in momentum threw Claire forward against the dash and sent Dan jerking sideways. Darius used the shift to his advantage, wrapping his arm around the man's chest and dragging him backward across the seat with sheer, unrelenting force. Dan kicked, flailed, cursed with words that stopped being coherent. But Darius didn't let go. He wasn't aiming to injure. He was ending the threat. "Stop the truck!" Darius growled, his voice low but sharp, every word fired like a command. Now. Dan reached for the wheel again, trying to jerk it right, but Darius wrapped a forearm around his neck and yanked him back again, forcing the truck to drift off the shoulder. Tires screamed as they scraped against the edge of a drainage ditch, the entire vehicle jolting with a hard bounce that sent dust flying across the roadside. Claire cried out, curled now with both arms over her head. Dan let out a strangled grunt, still trying to fight, still refusing to accept the reality of what was happening. The truck swerved one final time before jolting into the soft slope of a ditch and stopping at an angle, one front wheel lifted slightly off the ground. The engine coughed, hissed, then died. Silence followed. Darius released Dan with one final push and shoved the door open with his elbow, stepping out of the truck, chest rising and falling with hard, deliberate breath. His body ached, his ribs throbbing, his arms burning from the deflection, a raw sting along his shoulder where the crowbar had grazed him. But he remained standing. Across the street, a woman stood on her front lawn, frozen in place, her phone aimed directly at them, her finger pressed to the screen as it captured everything. Behind her, two more neighbors had emerged, both silent, both watching. One of them was already dialing, the other just staring, their eyes wide and unblinking. Inside the truck, Dan slumped against the steering wheel, groaning. Darius leaned back in through the open door, his voice low but clear. "It didn't have to be this." Dan spat on the floorboard and turned toward him, his voice raspy but full of hate. "You think this is over? You don't know what you just did. I know people. Cops. Real ones. They're not gonna protect someone like you." Darius didn't respond immediately. He watched the man's face carefully, the way he tried to rebuild his pride with threats, even now, even after everything. Then he spoke, slowly, clearly, without fear. "Good," he said. "Let them come. Just make sure they see the footage first." Dan stared at him, confused, then followed his gaze across the street, toward the woman still filming, toward the neighbors holding their breath, toward the world that had finally started watching. And for the first time, the fear wasn't Darius's to carry. The sirens sliced through the heat-thick silence, growing louder until the first cruiser rounded the corner and came to a sharp stop near the broken curb. The second followed close behind, lights flashing red and blue across the cracked windshield of Darius's SUV and the crumpled grass around the truck. Doors opened fast. Officers stepped out with practiced urgency, scanning the scene like they already had a version in their minds and were just waiting to slot in the details. Claire moved first. Her voice was already trembling, her posture folded into that small, vulnerable shape she had worn before. Arms pulled in, phone clutched close, tears forming not from grief, but as tools, as script. Officers, oh God, thank goodness. Please, please help. He attacked us. He chased us, broke our window, jumped in the truck. I didn't think we were going to make it. One of the officers, a tall, broad man with sandy hair and sharp cheekbones, placed a steadying hand near his belt as he glanced toward Darius, already sizing him up, already watching the angle of his shoulders and the calm in his face, as if that calm might somehow be suspicious. The second officer, a woman with a tight bun and narrowed eyes, approached the truck and looked at Dan, who had slid partially out, cradling his ribs, his face contorted with pain and something more bitter. She said nothing yet, waiting to see who would speak first. He was out of control, Dan said hoarsely. You should see the inside of the truck. He forced his way in. My wife was screaming. He was yelling, threatening her. I tried to protect her, and he just kept coming. The first officer turned toward Darius. Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them. Darius raised both arms slowly, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew exactly how this looked and what could happen if he didn't move the right way. I understand, he said calmly. But before anything else, I need you to know that what they just told you isn't the whole story, and there's video footage to prove it. The officer narrowed his eyes. What kind of footage? At that moment, a quiet voice piped up from behind the police cruiser. I got some of it. Not everything, but I started filming when the fight broke out near the benches. A teenager stepped forward, gangly and nervous. Maybe 15 or 16, still wearing a backpack that looked too big for his shoulders. He held out his phone, the screen shaking slightly in his hand. I was walking back from the bus stop, he added. I saw the guy in the blue shirt, he pointed to Dan, hit first. The other guy didn't even hit back right away. He just blocked and tried to calm him down. The female officer took the phone, and she and her partner watched for a few silent moments. The footage was shaky, but clear enough. Dan's voice yelling. The punch thrown. Darius stepping back, not advancing. Calm, then chaos. The kid had stopped filming when the truck sped off, too overwhelmed to follow. But what he caught was enough to make them hesitate. Claire's voice cracked as she tried to explain. He didn't see the beginning. He didn't see what happened before. He wasn't there when that man got violent in the park. Actually, came another voice, this time from the sidewalk across the street. I was. A woman stepped out from the shade of a porch, sunglasses perched on her head, her phone still raised. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her expression unreadable. I was jogging by when she slapped him, the woman said, pointing at Claire. Then I watched her scream like she was the one being attacked. I didn't catch it all on video, but I've got the slap and what she said before it. The part about people like you. And I saw her throw that rock. The silence that followed stretched longer this time. The officers exchanged a glance. The woman handed her phone to the second officer, who began reviewing her clip, while Claire's face blanched visibly, her mouth opening but no words forming. Dan shifted on his feet, eyes narrowing at the woman with a mix of disbelief and barely contained fury. Then another car door closed. A third officer had arrived with the second cruiser, but hadn't yet spoken. He stepped forward now, tall, black, with a slow and steady stride, his eyes scanning the broken glass, the dented grass, the tension in the air. He stopped when he saw Darius. You're Darius Cole, he said, not asking, just confirming. Darius gave a slight nod. Yes, sir. The officer tilted his head, studying him for a long second. Lieutenant Commander Cole, retired Navy, Bronze Star with Valor. Meritorious Service. Jalalabad, 2008. That you? Yes, sir. The officer turned to the others and gestured for them to lower their hands from their belts. Uncuff him. Don't touch him. He's not a suspect. Claire let out a sharp, brittle gasp, her voice climbing fast again. He threatened us. Are you going to let him get away with this? The officer turned, his face still calm, but his voice colder now. Ma'am, we've got 2 separate videos, a damaged vehicle with your fingerprints on the rock inside it, and multiple eyewitnesses all saying the same thing. I suggest you stop talking and wait for your statement to be taken. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it, her hands falling slowly to her sides. The performance had run out of lines. Dan looked away. The officer approached Darius once more. You good? I will be, Darius said, his eyes drifting toward the SUV down the road, where Ava and Caleb were still sitting inside, waiting, watching. The officer nodded once. We'll get this sorted. And this time, they're not going to spin it. And for the first time that day, Darius allowed himself to believe that maybe the truth would actually be enough. By the time the officers wrapped up their final notes and left the scene under dimming light, the sun had already begun its descent behind the rooftops of Glen Ridge, casting long, slanted shadows across the pavement and the edges of the now quiet park. The broken grass near the ditch where Dan's truck had landed remained a scar across the calm afternoon, a mark of what had unfolded in a place that, just hours earlier, had echoed with laughter and the slow crackle of a family's barbecue fire. Darius stood near the SUV, one hand resting lightly on the hood, watching Ava and Caleb through the window as they sat together in the back seat, huddled close, no longer afraid but still watchful, still absorbing the weight of a day that had not started with violence but had ended wrapped in it. He didn't speak. Not yet. There was too much in the air, too much unspoken, too much unresolved. Though the officers had left without making any arrests, the last words from the commanding officer still rang clear in his mind. We'll follow this up, and this time they're not going to spin it. But Darius knew too well that spin did not only happen in courtrooms or behind police stations. It happened in whispers, in meetings behind closed doors, in the quiet spaces where truth could be softened or shaped, unless someone forced it into the open. He had barely driven home before the first videos appeared online. They started small, short clips, raw footage captured by the teen and the jogger, shaky at times, but damning in their clarity. One showed Claire stepping forward and striking Darius before flinging herself backward into the role of victim, her voice already pitched high and trembling. The performance so sharp, it almost masked the malice behind it. Another video followed with footage of the fight, Dan's fists flying wild, while Darius stood rooted, defending himself but never losing control. The third clip, filmed from across the street, caught the rock striking the windshield, the shattering glass, the screams from inside the car, and the moment Darius broke into a sprint with a look that told the world everything it needed to know about what he was protecting. Within hours, the clips had been merged, captioned, and reposted. The internet had seen the story. And now, the internet wanted more. By nightfall, Claire's name had surfaced. Someone from the neighborhood recognized her from a homeowners association meeting, matched her voice to a recent community video, and within minutes, a thread had begun to spread detailing her position as president of the Glen Ridge HOA, accompanied by photos from her social media, screenshots of newsletters she had signed, and carefully worded mission statements about preserving the community's values. It wasn't long before the comments followed, some hesitant, some angry, and others written by people who had clearly been waiting for this moment. They spoke of letters posted to doors, written in clipped, passive language, reminding certain families to observe trash day etiquette or to consider repainting fences that weren't aesthetically consistent with community norms. They recalled anonymous complaints that always seemed to fall on renters and families of color, while others with similar issues received warm reminders or gentle courtesy calls. One woman posted about a backyard birthday party that had been shut down after 3 noise complaints filed in the same afternoon, though the speakers had only been turned on long enough for 2 songs. Another recalled how Claire once suggested that welcome mats should be uniform in style to ensure a neat appearance across entrances, just days after a new black homeowner had placed a mat with a family name written in gold script across it. But it was a direct message from a man named Andre Powell that shifted Darius's thoughts from quiet vindication into something far more decisive. The message was simple. It included only a name, a phone number, and the words, "She's done this before. We need to talk." When Darius called, the voice on the other end carried the same weight he felt in his own chest, the heavy quiet of someone who had held back for too long. Andre explained that his family had moved into Glenridge 3 years earlier, excited for the stability the neighborhood promised, eager to build something permanent and peaceful for their daughter. But almost immediately, things began to change. Small infractions were reported. Letters started appearing. Warnings about trash cans left out, even when they had been brought in on time. Notes about lawn maintenance despite professional landscaping contracts. And then came the noise complaints. 3 in a single month. None of them real. When Andre pushed back, Claire escalated. The HOA board, led by her, issued formal citations. She used anonymous complaint procedures to file false reports, claimed she was acting on behalf of multiple neighbors, and when Andre asked for proof, he was told it was confidential and that the association's role was to preserve peace, not justify discipline. Eventually, the family received a notice of legal action for ongoing violations. Andre's wife, terrified of the escalation, convinced him to move before their daughter had to see police cars outside her home for no reason at all. But the part that mattered most, the part that shifted Darius from reflection into action, was what came next. Andre had kept everything. He had emails, letters, and internal documents anonymously shared by a sympathetic board member. One of the noise complaints had been written by Claire herself, forged under a false name. The signature, the timestamps, even the phrasing, it all pointed to a deliberate, calculated effort to force their family out. By morning, Andre had sent Darius a scanned copy of the document, along with a copy of the notice his family had received threatening eviction. Darius read it 3 times, and with each pass, something cold and focused settled in his chest. Not rage, not revenge, but a sense of clarity that he hadn't felt since the moment Claire had approached him in the park. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't lost control. She had followed a pattern. He sent the evidence to his attorney that afternoon. He contacted the local news desk again, this time with names, dates, and records. He spoke with 2 other families who had come forward after seeing the video, each one telling him a variation of the same story. The subtle targeting, the coded language, the pressure that always seemed to push hardest against the families who didn't look like the ones in Claire's welcome brochures. And then, with Ava and Caleb sitting nearby and the television off for the first time all week, Darius opened his laptop and began writing. He didn't write to vent. He didn't write to accuse. He wrote to expose. He told the story exactly as it had happened, from the barbecue to the slap, from the lie to the rock, from the fight to the chase, and all the way to the badge that hadn't come to hurt, but had remembered who he was before the story could be rewritten again. He ended his statement with one final line, direct, unflinching, and true. She tried to make me the threat, because she knew what would happen if people believed her. But this time, the truth had witnesses, and this time, The lie didn't win. He hit publish. And the world, already watching, leaned in closer. The arrests came quietly, but not in secret. It happened on a Monday morning, just after sunrise, when Glenridge was still wrapped in the stillness of its routine. Sprinklers spinning across manicured lawns, joggers weaving past garden beds, and porch lights flickering off as the sun took its place overhead. A single patrol car rolled down the main street, followed by an unmarked vehicle that came to a slow, deliberate stop in front of Claire and Dan Weston's two-story colonial near the north gate. The neighborhood watch signs in the yard tilted slightly in the wind, but the house itself looked just as it always had. Prim, polished, impenetrable. Until now, two officers walked up the path. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. Claire answered the door already in a pressed blouse and slacks, her hair pinned neatly, as if she had dressed for a meeting, or for control, or for some version of herself that could talk her way out of whatever was coming. She began speaking before the first officer could explain the charges: misdemeanor assault, filing a false police report, destruction of property. But her voice didn't rise in fear. It rose in disbelief, in that same cold defiance she had used in the park, the same tone that had carried her through years of getting away with more than she ever admitted out loud. Dan followed behind her, slower, face already set in the pale stubbornness of someone who believed the worst had passed. But the cuffs still closed around his wrists. The Miranda warning still played out word for word, and the walk to the back of the patrol car was slow, public, and recorded. Across the street, curtains shifted. Neighbors watched. Some filmed, some didn't, and some looked away entirely. By mid-morning, the news had broken, not just through social media, but on the front page of the local digital gazette, complete with stills from the footage, excerpts from the official police report, and a sidebar featuring community reactions. The headline didn't soften the story. It didn't offer Claire the protection of ambiguity. It read, Glenridge HOA President arrested after racial harassment. Assault on decorated veteran and children. The article included quotes from Darius's online statement, links to the videos, and a timeline of the event, from barbecue to arrest. It also included new developments, testimonies from families who had come forward in the days following Darius's post, each detailing years of quiet cruelty under Claire's leadership. There were screenshots of emails, copies of warnings, even a letter that had been sent to a black homeowner last year suggesting they avoid using colors that stand out too much on the garage. And then came the interview. Darius hadn't planned on going on camera. He hadn't intended to become the face of someone else's shame. But when the local station requested a sit-down, offering a full segment and promising editorial control, he agreed, not because he needed to be seen, but because he needed his children to see that when the world tries to silence you, there is still power in truth, especially when spoken with clarity and restraint. He arrived at the studio in a plain charcoal button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbow, no tie. His posture was composed, his expression calm. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need to. The interviewer, a young black woman named Serena, who had clearly done her homework, asked questions with care. She didn't provoke, didn't dramatize. She simply gave him space. He filled it with dignity. I didn't start recording, he said quietly, because I wanted to catch someone. I didn't even know I was being recorded. I stayed calm because my kids were there. That's what mattered most. I've been in combat. I've led men into places where not everyone came back, but nothing prepares you for what it feels like when someone targets your children. That's not just about race. That's about humanity. Serena nodded slowly. What do you want to happen now? I want accountability, he answered. Not just for me. For every family that was silenced, for every letter slipped onto a porch, for every warning masked as a suggestion. I want this community to ask why she got away with it for so long. The interview aired that evening. The clip was shared hundreds of times within hours. But even as the truth spread, the community did not respond with one voice. Some rallied behind Darius. They left notes at his doorstep. They sent messages of support through the HOA's anonymous comment box. A few organized a community meeting, inviting residents of color to speak about their experiences. Others volunteered to testify on record, even those who had once stayed silent. But not all turned. Some clung harder to Claire's version of the story. They posted in neighborhood forums, claiming things had been blown out of proportion, that Claire had only been enforcing community standards, that this was all a misunderstanding gone viral. A few accused Darius of exaggerating, of turning a park disagreement into a witch hunt. One even suggested he had provoked the slap on purpose, though the video had clearly shown otherwise. It didn't matter. The truth was already moving. Each time someone spoke against him, another family came forward. A retired schoolteacher shared a story about Claire reporting her son for skateboarding on the sidewalk, on his own block. A mother of twins admitted she had been told her backyard playhouse was too urban in color. A black postal worker revealed that Claire once followed him down 3 streets and called the non-emergency line to ask if he had permission to deliver off route. And through it all, Darius remained exactly as he had been the moment the fight ended. He walked Ava and Caleb to school the next morning, not because they needed the protection, but because he needed them to know that no one had taken their peace. He smiled when other parents waved. He didn't flinch when a few turned away. The line had been drawn now, between those who had seen the truth and those who refused to look at it. And this time, Darius had no intention of stepping back from it. The Glenridge Homeowners Association did not speak for 5 days. In a neighborhood where even the planting of sunflowers outside season was swiftly met with a citation, the silence from the HOA board echoed louder than any siren that had passed through the streets earlier that week. No emails arrived. No statements were posted on the community board near the mailbox pavilion. The newsletter, which usually opened each month with a word from the president and a reminder about upcoming dues, quietly disappeared without explanation. And inside their neat, white-trimmed homes, board members met behind drawn curtains, holding long, whispered phone calls filled with legal caution, worried glances, and sudden second thoughts about signatures they had once offered without hesitation. It had become increasingly clear that the distance they were trying to create was no longer sufficient. The truth had already broken past the tidy language they had always used to explain away discomfort. What had once been defended as a matter of upholding community standards now stood exposed as something far uglier. An organized, silent system of quiet exclusion that had worn a smile as it closed its doors. When the HOA finally did speak, the words arrived early on a Saturday morning, printed on crisp white paper and delivered directly to every doorstep in the neighborhood. The message also appeared in inboxes just after dawn. The subject line neutral but unmistakable. A message from the Glenridge HOA board. The letter opened with a tone that felt polished and practiced, written not in outrage or remorse, but in the cautious language of institutions attempting to protect their structure, while discarding the face that had tainted it. Still, hidden beneath that cautious diplomacy was something unmistakable. A full, public disavowal of Claire Weston. Effective immediately, Claire had been removed from her role as HOA president. The board stated that it did not condone actions rooted in discrimination, intimidation, or false reporting. They promised an independent review of past enforcement actions and policies, and concluded with a pledge to restore trust and ensure every resident, regardless of background, felt safe and welcome in the community. There was no mention of Darius. There was no apology. But for those who had lived under Claire's rule, who had adjusted their lives in small, humiliating ways to avoid drawing her attention, the letter marked the first visible crack in the surface of Glenridge's pristine order. Some residents responded with quiet satisfaction. Others called the statement overdue. A few posted praise online, calling the decision bold and necessary, as if the board had not been complicit until the tide turned. And there were still those, fewer now, but still present, who insisted that Claire had simply done her job, that she had enforced rules others ignored, and that her fall was not justice, but public hysteria. Those voices clung to the story she had written, refusing to let go even as the ink had run dry. And then, just as the outrage had begun to settle into routines and the conversations had started to shift, something unexpected brought the truth into even sharper focus. The revelation did not come from a former neighbor or a long silent resident. It came not from a journalist or a politician. It came from someone far closer, someone who had once known Claire before she had polished her voice, before she had learned how to make racism sound like regulation, before she had become the symbol of a neighborhood's quiet sickness. Her name was Marion James, and she was Claire Weston's younger sister. It began with a single comment, posted late at night under a community thread that had grown into a living archive of Claire's years in power. The username was unfamiliar, Marion J82, but the words written beneath it could not be ignored. I am Claire Weston's sister, and it's time someone told the truth. The forum paused. Replies appeared immediately, many asking if it was real, others urging her to speak further. And then, after hours of silence, she did. The next morning, Marion gave a live radio interview with a regional news outlet, her voice steady and deliberate, her decision to speak not emotional, but resolute. She began by saying that for too long, Claire had been protected by the people who knew her best, by those who saw her for what she was, and said nothing. She explained that Claire had not become this person in Glenridge. She had always been this person. Marion spoke of their childhood, of a father who ruled the house with pride and prejudice, of dinner tables where those people were always blamed for what was wrong in the world. She described how Claire learned to control with politeness, to make judgment sound like concern, to wear condescension like grace. But what cut deepest was what Marion said next. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to use slurs. She used rules. She used systems. She believed if she could dress her prejudice up in policy, no one would question her. And for a long time, no one did. The interviewer asked why she had waited. Marion's response was quiet, but carried a weight Darius understood instantly. Because when I tried to tell people who she really was, they said I was exaggerating, that I was bitter, that I was just the sister who always resented her spotlight. Even when she cut me off after I married a black man, even when she told me not to bring my adopted daughters to Thanksgiving because they might make our parents uncomfortable, I stayed silent because I didn't want to be dismissed again. But now, someone else was hurt. Publicly. Violently. And I couldn't watch it happen from the sidelines again. The clip was shared thousands of times across every platform. News outlets reposted the quote with headlines like, "Family member of disgraced HOA president speaks out. She always knew exactly what she was doing." Images of Claire, once shown in neighborhood newsletters with ribbons and flags, were now paired beside bold captions that detailed harassment, exclusion, and a legacy built not on leadership, but on fear. Darius didn't react publicly to the interview, but he listened. He watched the shift that followed. He saw how people began not only to understand what had happened to him and his children, but how they began to understand what had always been happening, long before cameras were pointed, long before footage was played, long before Claire had finally been caught. He knew that Marion's words had done what even the video could not. They had broken the illusion that Claire was an outlier. They had forced the community to ask how long they had allowed her to speak for them. And as headlines changed, and petitions grew, and the first whispers of a full restructuring within the HOA began to spread, Darius remained focused not on the noise, but on the path ahead. He had never wanted attention. He had never asked to be a symbol. He had only wanted his children to grow up in a place where truth wasn't a luxury, where lies didn't win just because they were shouted louder. Now the mask was off, and the community was seeing Claire, not for what she had claimed to be, but for what she had always been. The courtroom was quiet, not in the way of reverence or fear, but with the thick, weighted silence of a space that had been bracing itself for what everyone already knew was coming. The morning sun had climbed high outside the narrow windows, casting bright angles of light across the polished floor. But inside, there was nothing warm about the atmosphere. Every seat in the gallery had been filled, the front rows lined with neighbors and community members who had lived on the same streets as Claire Weston, passed her at the market, attended her board meetings, or stood silent while her decisions changed lives without notice. At the center of it all, Claire sat behind the defense table, dressed in soft beige, her hair styled simply, her face lightly powdered in a way that attempted humility, as though simplicity could undo what the footage and testimonies had already revealed. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief that looked more decorative than necessary, her expression shaped into a carefully curated mix of regret and fear. Her attorney, a man with the polished charm of someone used to controlling narratives rather than dismantling them, stood beside her, speaking in a measured tone as he introduced her testimony. Mrs. Weston would like to share her side of the events that have so deeply impacted this community. What happened that day was not the result of malice, but misunderstanding. A moment of confusion that escalated in a way none of us would wish for. Claire nodded as she stood and walked to the witness stand, each step placed with practiced poise. When she took her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and when she looked toward the jury, her voice wavered with an ache that had been rehearsed more times than the truth itself. "I was scared," she said, her tone trembling just enough to pull at sympathy. "That's what I keep trying to explain. I wasn't trying to be hateful. I wasn't trying to provoke anyone. I saw something that didn't feel right. A man barbecuing where I didn't think it was allowed. I thought he might be a danger. I acted out of concern, not hate." She paused, letting the silence hang, letting her words fill the space with ambiguity, as if her fear could be interpreted as reason, as if her discomfort could be accepted as an apology. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. I didn't know he had children with him. I didn't know he was a veteran. I panicked. I called my husband. I reacted like anyone would have if they believed they were in danger." The tears came slowly, falling with the rhythm of someone who had learned long ago how to make emotion work in her favor. Her shoulders shook slightly. She looked down, then up again, as if gathering herself. "But I never meant to hurt anyone," she continued, "especially not a family." Her lawyer placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as she finished, then addressed the court with a brief reminder of her years of community service, her volunteer efforts, her role in maintaining neighborhood cohesion. He asked the court to consider the whole person, not just the single incident, as if everything before it could erase what the world had seen with its own eyes. When it was Darius's turn to testify, he did not rise quickly. He stood with the same composure he had carried in the park, in the truck bed, and in every quiet moment since, his presence unshaken not by pride, but by purpose. He wore a dark navy suit, plain and professional, no pins, no ribbons. He wasn't there to be a symbol. He wasn't there to perform strength. He was there to speak the truth, clearly, plainly, and without the weight of theatrics. When he took the stand, he did not glance at Claire. He faced the jury, met their eyes, and began without apology or flourish. "My name is Darius Cole. I'm a retired Navy lieutenant commander. I served for 16 years, including deployments in combat zones. I have 2 children, Ava, who is 10, and Caleb, who just turned 7. On the day in question, we were in Glenridge Park, having a barbecue in a designated area that, by both state and local code, is entirely legal for public use." His tone was not defensive. It was rooted in fact, his delivery measured, every word chosen with care. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift blame. He laid out the sequence of events exactly as they occurred. How Claire had approached him. How her comments turned passive-aggressive. How she had escalated from questioning his presence to fabricating rules. He explained how she slapped him. How she screamed as if she were the one being attacked. How her husband arrived and threw the first punch. He described the moment the rock hit the windshield with his children inside. And as he spoke, the courtroom leaned forward, not because he was dramatic, but because he wasn't. He didn't use emotion as armor. He didn't need to. "I didn't respond in anger," he said toward the end of his testimony. "Not because I wasn't angry, but because my kids were watching. Because I know how this goes. Because if I had raised my voice or pushed back, the story would have been written before I could speak." She knew that. She counted on it. The room remained still. Claire didn't meet his gaze now. Her tears had dried. Her handkerchief lay folded on the table. "I wasn't the threat that day," Darius said, "but I was treated like one. Not because of what I did, but because of what she assumed. And if there hadn't been footage, if there hadn't been witnesses, if there hadn't been people willing to tell the truth, my children would have had to carry the weight of that lie for the rest of their lives." He paused, not for effect, but to breathe, to settle the air that had thickened with the gravity of what had been laid bare. "I came here today not for vengeance, but for clarity. What she did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and it nearly cost my family something that no apology could return." When he stepped down from the stand, he did not glance back. He returned to his seat with the same quiet strength that had carried him through every moment since that afternoon in the park. And though the courtroom remained silent, the shift had already happened, because when the truth is spoken with composure, when it is stripped of performance and laid bare in full, even the loudest lie begins to sound hollow by comparison. The room felt colder on the day Ava took the stand. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The kind of quiet that settled across the courtroom when the weight of something sacred was about to be spoken aloud. The gallery, still packed with familiar faces and silent witnesses, shifted subtly as her name was called. Reporters stopped scribbling. Parents leaned forward. Jurors adjusted in their seats, as if, for just a moment, they were no longer watching a trial, but something far more fragile. Darius stood beside his daughter as she approached the witness stand, not to speak, but to offer the steadying presence she had known since birth. She walked with care, not hesitation, wearing the dress she had chosen herself that morning. A soft blue with small white buttons, her hair neatly braided, her shoes polished but still showing the scuff marks of playgrounds and childhood. She climbed the step, sat upright in the chair, and folded her hands neatly in her lap before looking toward the judge. The prosecutor spoke gently, his voice lowered, guiding her through the process like a father might guide a hand across a stream. "Ava," he said softly, "can you tell us, in your own words, what you remember about that day in the park?" She nodded once before speaking, her voice small but unshaking, clear in a way that only children who have seen too much can manage. "We were having lunch," she said. "Dad was grilling, and Caleb and I were sitting on the blanket. We were laughing because he dropped his juice box. A few smiles flickered in the room, brief and respectful. Then the lady came. She started talking to my dad. I couldn't hear all the words, but I could tell she wasn't being nice. She kept pointing and talking fast. My dad didn't yell. He just stood there. But then she hit him, and then she screamed like something bad happened, even though she was the one who hit him. She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the seat now. He told us to go to the car. So we did. He locked the doors. I held Caleb's hand and told him it was going to be okay. But then the rock hit the window, right in front of Caleb's face. It was really loud. The room was utterly still. I didn't scream right away. I was trying to be brave, but my little brother was crying, and I thought we were going to get hurt. Not because of the rock, but because people were going to believe her, because she was already lying. And she looked so sure, like she knew no one would ask what really happened. The prosecutor took a moment before responding. You were scared. Ava nodded again, this time slower. Yes, but not just of her. I was scared that no one would believe my dad, that they'd say he was the problem, even though he didn't do anything. He was just protecting us. The judge cleared his throat quietly, nodding once as Ava finished her statement. She looked toward her father then, and Darius gave her a soft, proud nod. His eyes damp but steady, the same calm anchored in him now mirrored in his daughter. She stepped down from the stand to gentle applause. Quiet, respectful, not permitted, but not silenced. No one dared interrupt the dignity of what had just been shared. What followed was not dramatic. The final arguments came and went, both sides summarizing what the courtroom already understood. The evidence had been clear. The testimonies had been consistent. The videos had captured the truth in angles and echoes, but it was Ava's voice, filled with innocence, that should have never been tested like that had sealed the understanding of the jury in a way no footage could have done. When the bailiff returned with the slip, folded and passed forward, there was no whispering, no gasps, no speculation. The judge opened it, read it, and delivered the verdict with the same steady voice he had used throughout the trial. But this time, the weight of the words landed like stone. Claire Weston, guilty of filing a false police report, guilty of public endangerment, guilty of attempted child endangerment. Each charge read aloud marked a reckoning, not just for what had happened that day, but for the years that had come before it. The slow violence dressed as order, the quiet persecution masked as neighborhood maintenance. She did not cry this time. There were no more handkerchiefs to hold her narrative together. Her posture sagged not in grief, but in recognition that the story she had always controlled was no longer hers to write. Dan Weston, guilty of assault with intent to cause bodily harm, guilty of contributing to endangerment, guilty of obstruction. When he stood to receive his verdict, he did not shout, did not protest. The smug confidence he had worn in the park, in the truck, and through the first half of the trial had been eroded piece by piece. He looked not at the judge, not at his wife, not at the jury. He looked at Darius, and in that moment saw not the man he had once tried to intimidate, but the man who had stood through everything, unmoved, unbroken. Sentencing would follow in the coming weeks. The attorneys would speak again. There would be appeals. There always were. But the verdict was clear. The message had been written in record, in law, and in the eyes of every person who had watched it unfold. Darius walked from the courtroom with Ava's hand in his pace slow, not because he was tired, but because he wanted her to know there was no rush now. Justice had arrived not in fury or vengeance, but in clarity. What they had endured would remain with them, but it would not define them. They had told the truth, and this time, the world had listened. Outside, reporters called his name. Cameras flashed. He didn't stop. He only reached for Caleb's hand as they approached the car. And together, the three of them stepped forward. Not into headlines, but into something far quieter, far more valuable. Peace. Change did not arrive in Glenridge overnight. It didn't come with grand announcements or sweeping celebrations. There were no parades, no fireworks, no headlines declaring a new era. What came instead were smaller signs, quiet acknowledgments stitched together by the people who had once watched from the margins and now found themselves invited to the center of the table. It began with a meeting, one that took place not in the sterile, overly air-conditioned HOA conference room where Claire Weston had once presided with clipped smiles and tighter agendas, but in the community library's public forum space, where the chairs didn't match, and the walls were lined with donated books. The turnout surprised even those who had planned it. Long rows filled with neighbors of every background, some still cautious, some still skeptical, but many ready to listen, to speak, and, most importantly, to stay. Darius hadn't intended to lead. He had come to listen, his children beside him, Ava carrying a folder of handwritten notes just in case she decided she wanted to speak again. But when the facilitator, a younger board member recently appointed after the public demanded leadership turnover, asked Darius if he would share a few words to open the session, he didn't hesitate. He stood, not for a speech, but with the steady presence that had carried him through far worse than a town hall. His voice was calm. His words were direct. He didn't use statistics. He didn't quote laws. He spoke only about experience, about what it meant to raise children in a place where you could be seen but not always welcomed, where your presence was acknowledged but not always accepted, where the rules could bend depending on who they were being written for. He spoke only about experience, about what it meant to raise children in a place where you could be seen but not always welcomed, where your presence was acknowledged but not always accepted, where the rules could bend depending on who they were being written for. And he told them what it had meant, in the quietest, clearest way, to finally see that change wasn't just possible, but already starting. That night, a new committee was formed, one focused on community standards, inclusion, and equity in enforcement. It was designed not to erase the past, but to confront it head-on, to document how enforcement had historically been applied unevenly, to review every policy, every procedure, and every person who had benefited from silence. Darius was asked to chair the committee. He refused the title, but agreed to serve. "I don't want a podium," he said. "I just want to make sure no one else has to explain their existence to prove they belong here." Over the following weeks, Glenridge began to change in visible ways. The park, once a stage for confrontation, was re-examined and reimagined. New signage was installed, this time approved not by the board alone, but by community vote. The signs didn't just outline rules and regulations. They celebrated diversity, acknowledged shared ownership of public space, and welcomed every family with clear, intentional language. At the entrance to the barbecue area where Darius and his children had sat that day, a new plaque was added. Simple in design but deliberate in message, it read, "This space belongs to everyone. Let it be used with joy, with safety, and with respect. In memory of those who stood their ground not with anger, but with truth." There was no mention of Darius's name. He had asked it be left off. The story, he said, was not about him. It was about what the community chose to become after the mask had been pulled off. But the story did not end in Glenridge. Not long after the verdict, Darius received a phone call from the city's Office of Civilian Public Safety. The director, a woman named Eileen Wu, had followed the case closely. She had read the transcripts, watched the footage, and heard the interviews. Her voice, though confident, carried a quiet reverence as she spoke. "We're building something new," she told him. "A leadership team focused on reimagining public safety, one that includes not just policy advisors, but lived experience. We need voices like yours. You'd be serving as a civilian liaison, shaping training, setting new protocols. You wouldn't have to carry a badge. But you'd be helping shape the way our officers understand the people they serve." Darius listened. He asked questions. He considered what it would mean for his family, for his time, for the quiet he had just started to reclaim. And then, after a long pause, he gave her his answer. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I don't need a title to do the work. I've got kids to raise, a life to live. But if you're serious about change, I'll meet you halfway." She didn't push. Instead, she asked, "What would halfway look like?" "I'll help train your officers," he replied. "I'll talk to them about what de-escalation looks like. Not just in the field, but in real life, in front yards, in parks, in silence. I'll teach them how to read the air before it thickens, how to see what's about to happen, not just what's already gone wrong. And so he did. Twice a month, Darius drove to the city's public safety building, stepped into a training room filled with fresh recruits and veterans alike, and told them what it meant to be the calmest man in the room and still be seen as the threat. He walked them through real situations, broke down moments they had only seen from behind tinted windshields. He spoke not in theory, but in truth. He never lectured. He taught. And as the city quietly adjusted its approach, as more neighborhoods began creating their own committees, as Glenridge became something new, not perfect, but progressing, Darius returned home each evening, not to applause or articles, but to the sound of Ava reading aloud in the kitchen, to Caleb building cities with blocks that would never fall unless he chose to knock them over himself. He had not asked to be the catalyst, but he had become the constant. Not because he raised his voice, but because he had never once lowered it to make others feel comfortable in the face of truth. 1 year later, Glenridge Park no longer looked the way it once had. The trees were the same, tall and wide-branched with leaves that rustled gently in the warm breeze. The grass still stretched out across the field in soft green waves. The picnic benches remained arranged beneath the sheltering awnings, and the smell of sun-warmed earth still drifted from the mulch beds near the swings. But something in the air had changed. Something not built, not painted, not installed, but felt. The families gathered there that day were not all the same, not cut from the same cloth or bound by old neighborhood loyalties. They looked like the city itself. Black, Latino, Asian, white, mixed. Kids chased each other through the open spaces without glancing over their shoulders. Parents leaned over portable coolers, unpacking dishes they hadn't worried would be judged. Conversations moved easily between strangers. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker tucked near the edge of the tables, and no one complained. Darius stood near the grill, the same one he had brought out a year before, though this time it was surrounded by other grills, other folding chairs, other families. He worked the tongs slowly, flipping ribs that hissed and seared with each turn. A small line had formed beside him, neighbors holding empty plates, laughing as they waited, offering to trade side dishes or swap seasoning tips like it had always been this way. It hadn't always been this way, but now it was. Caleb sat cross-legged on a picnic blanket, eyes focused on a game of Uno he was slowly losing to a confident girl from 2 blocks over. Ava walked between tables with a clipboard in hand, collecting names for the new Community Culture Day newsletter she'd proposed to the Inclusion Committee. A day of art, food, and storytelling she wanted to see hosted every season. Her father had offered to help her organize it, but she had waved him off. "I got it," she had said, her smile sure, her voice steady. "You already did your part." The new sign near the barbecue area glinted in the sun, its polished surface catching the light just enough to be noticed, but not enough to demand attention. People still stopped to read it. No one rolled their eyes. No one asked why it had been installed. It simply belonged, a quiet part of the space, like the tables, like the trees, like the families who now knew this park was truly theirs. It was Ava who noticed them first. She didn't say anything right away. She only walked back to the grill, leaned lightly against her father's side, and tilted her chin subtly toward the edge of the parking lot. Darius followed her gaze without needing direction. Dan and Claire Weston stood near the public tool shed, wearing orange safety vests that didn't match their clothes or their posture. Claire carried a trash picker in one hand, a half-filled bag in the other. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung flat against her face, and her eyes no longer scanned the park like they once had, no longer moved with that searching gaze of someone trying to control a space. She didn't look toward the crowd. She kept her focus low, shoulders rounded, steps small. Dan followed behind, slower, heavier, dragging a rake across the dirt path that lined the edge of the park. His presence, once barked into every space he entered, now moved with silence. He said nothing. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. Someone near the swing set whispered, not loudly, but loud enough for Darius to hear. "That's them." The words carried no awe, no fear, no edge. Just recognition, like pointing out a landmark in passing, like identifying a shadow and realizing it no longer loomed the way it used to. Darius didn't move. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He turned back to the grill and slid a rib onto a waiting plate, handed it to a neighbor who thanked him with a nod, and moved on. His heart didn't race. His breath didn't catch, because this wasn't their story anymore. It wasn't about Claire. It wasn't about Dan. It wasn't even about the verdict. It was about this park, about his children, about what had been reclaimed not with shouting, not with vengeance, but with truth, patience, and the refusal to surrender. Ava stepped closer, still watching the couple in the distance, her expression unreadable. "They haven't looked over here once," she said. "They don't have to," Darius replied, his voice low but even. "They know." There was a pause, the kind that stretched not because of discomfort, but because something was settling into place, something final. Ava looked back at her father, then out across the park, where new families were arriving, where music continued to play, where children she had never met called her name to come join them. "We took it back," she said quietly. And Darius, his eyes still on the park, his hands still holding the tongs with steady ease, gave a single nod. "Yes," he said, his voice almost a whisper, but full of weight. "We did." No applause followed, no cheers, just the sizzle of food on the grill, the thump of a bouncing soccer ball nearby, and the low murmur of conversation in a dozen different languages and tones, all rising into the same sky. And for the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel like a break between battles. It felt permanent. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.